Doc Holliday graduated from dental school in 1872. He spoke French and Latin. He played piano. And within 2 years, he was shooting men in Texas saloons. Everyone talks about the gunfighter, but nobody asks what turned a cultured Southern dentist into one of the most feared men in the West. The answer starts with a 15-year-old boy wiping blood from his dying mother's mouth. It involves a father who betrayed him 3 months later, and a disease that was already eating him alive before he ever touched a gun. The real Doc Holliday was never who you thought. John Henry Holliday was born on August 14, 1851, in Griffin, Georgia, and nothing about that place looked anything like the Wild West people later tied to his name. Griffin was a growing cotton town, polished on the outside and uneasy underneath. His parents, Henry Burroughs Holliday and Alice Jane McKee Holliday, had money, status, and a good home. Still, the house was already carrying grief before John even arrived. Less than 15 months earlier, they had lost their first child, Martha Eleonora, who died as a baby on June 12, 1850, after living only 6 months and 9 days. So when John was born, he entered a family that had already learned how quickly joy could turn into fear. That loss stayed close. Church records later noted John's baptism on March 21, 1852, at the First Presbyterian Church, and it almost feels like his family was trying to place a shield around him. In those years, death came early and often in Southern homes. A child could be there 1 week and gone the next, so Alice held on to John with all the care she had. She was known as a gentle Southern beauty, but there was steel in her too. She taught him French, Latin, and piano inside their refined home, and for a while, his life looked smooth, cultured, and safe. But safety in that world was always thin. His father's drugstore did well, yet the fear that had already touched the family never truly left. That fear only deepened as the country broke apart. Henry served in the Civil War as a major in the 27th Georgia Infantry, and the war dragged sickness, chaos, and loss straight into family life. Disease followed soldiers everywhere. Dysentery tore through camps, and nothing stayed untouched for long. By the time John was 13, Georgia itself was burning under Sherman's advance, and the world he had known started falling apart. The family had to flee south in a rush, leaving behind the comfort that had once seemed permanent. So the polished childhood people imagine was already cracking early, and that mattered. Before Doc Holliday ever became a legend, he had already learned that life could turn hard without warning. The shadow of death had been there from the start, and in many ways, it began with Martha. Her death hit the Hollidays before John was even born, and even though he never knew her, that loss shaped the house he grew up in. No one could say for sure what killed her. In those days, it could have been fever, bad water, poor sanitation, or some illness no one understood in time. In towns like Griffin, infant deaths were painfully common. Families buried children and then went on living because they had no other choice. Yet those graves did not disappear from memory. They sat quietly in the background, and everyone carried them. Alice carried that grief especially hard. Her health was already fragile, and tuberculosis was likely already waiting in the shadows of her life. Some family stories say she held baby Martha through her final moments, and whether every detail is exact or not, the feeling behind it rings true. That loss bound her even more tightly to John when he came along. He became the child she poured herself into, the one she protected, taught, and held close, while Henry was often away or occupied. So John grew up not just loved, but watched over with a kind of intensity that usually comes after heartbreak. He was not simply a son. He was the child who remained. That made the bond between John and his mother unusually deep, and years later, it would become one of the most painful parts of his life. Alice was more than kind and elegant. She was educated, disciplined, and deeply involved in shaping him. She taught him at home, filled his mind with language and music, and gave him a refined world, even while the country around them was coming apart. Then tuberculosis took hold of her in full, and by 1866, the illness had become impossible to hide. John was 15. Instead of standing at a distance, he cared for her closely. He wiped away the blood in her cough, stayed near her, and watched the disease slowly break her down. Family stories later insisted that this was likely how he caught tuberculosis himself. When she died on September 16, 1866, it shattered him. Some accounts say she returned to Methodism shortly before her death, because she wanted John to understand her beliefs clearly before she was gone. What mattered most, though, was the loss itself. The person who had shaped his mind, softened his childhood, and held the family together was suddenly gone. Witnesses later described a boy broken by grief, and it is easy to see how something inside him changed right there. Alice had wanted him to study dentistry, a profession that matched the discipline and intelligence she valued in him. He followed that path, but after losing her, he did not follow it as the same person. The grief stayed in him, and so did the illness. His father was still there, but Henry was never the same kind of shelter. He was stern, practical, and shaped by war. He had fought in earlier conflicts too, and the Civil War only added to the damage already written into him. He had left the army in 1862 after suffering badly from dysentery, a brutal illness that weakened countless men. Then, when Sherman's forces cut through Georgia in 1864, Henry led the family out of danger and down toward Valdosta. They escaped destruction, but not without cost. Their old world was gone. The town they knew no longer felt stable. Their money, comfort, and sense of place had all been shaken. John saw that. He saw how quickly status could mean nothing when survival became the real concern. Henry later rebuilt much of his life in Valdosta and even rose to local importance again. But the emotional damage inside the family did not heal so neatly. Then, only 3 months after Alice died, Henry remarried. On December 18, 1866, he married Rachel Martin, a young woman much closer to John's age than his own. For a grieving 15-year-old boy, that had to feel like a blow he could not forgive. The house changed too fast. The mother who had filled every room with care was gone, and now someone new had stepped into her place almost immediately. Whether Rachel was cruel or not matters less than how it felt to John. To him, it likely looked like betrayal. That may have been the final break. The home that had already been wounded by death now felt unfamiliar too. John no longer had his mother, no longer trusted the shape of family life, and no longer believed in the kind of security he had once known. So when the time came, he moved forward into the future his mother had wanted for him. He went to study dentistry. On paper, it looked like the next respectable step for a bright Southern young man. In reality, it was also an exit. He began dental school in 1870, right in the middle of a broken post-war South that was still trying to stand back up. At 19, he traveled north to Philadelphia and entered the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery. The move itself says a lot. He was young, far from home, and stepping into a world built on precision, science, and discipline. He paid the fees, sat through long lectures on chemistry and anatomy, and learned to work with tools that were anything but gentle. Dentistry then was hard, physical work. Teeth were twisted out with crude instruments. Patients had little relief from pain. Blood, pressure, force, and endurance were all part of the job. He trained during the school year in Philadelphia and returned in the summers to apprentice under Lucien Frink in Valdosta. So while his classmates were still learning from books alone, he was already putting that learning into real hands on real patients. He filled teeth, pulled teeth, studied diseased roots, and learned every part of the work. There is something striking about that image, because this was not some drifter stumbling into violence. This was an educated young man working toward a serious profession, and he was good at it. That made his progress even more impressive, because he had his own challenge to overcome. He had been born with a cleft palate, and early in life that had affected his speech. His mother helped him fight through it with careful teaching and steady practice, and by the time he reached adulthood, the problem had been corrected so well that many people would never have guessed it. The same boy who had once struggled with speech was now writing a thesis on diseases of the teeth and studying a field that demanded patience, skill, and confidence. He was not drifting. He was building something. He graduated on March 1, 1872, at Philadelphia's Musical Fund Hall, and by all accounts, he had done well. He was not a fraud. He was not pretending. He earned the title. He knew the work. He understood the science available in his time, even though medicine still had huge blind spots. He could discuss anatomy, treat decay, make fillings, and work with gold and rubber prosthetics. In another life, that might have been enough. He might have stayed Dr. John Henry Holliday, a Southern dentist with a disciplined mind and a trained hand. But life was already turning against that future. Soon after graduation, he began trying to establish himself in Atlanta, working with Dr. Arthur C. Ford on Whitehall Street. It should have been the beginning of everything his mother had hoped for. Instead, tuberculosis stepped into the room and ruined it. Doctors examined him and gave him the same verdict that had already haunted his family: consumption. The same disease that had killed his mother was now eating into him too. There was no cure. There was no real treatment. There was only advice, and that advice was simple. Leave Georgia. Go west. Find dry air. Hope for more time. So the young dentist with the new degree, the formal training, and the polished manners suddenly found himself pushed out of the life he had prepared for. His cough got worse. Patients noticed. During dental work, that was a disaster. A man can survive a lot in private, but when your profession puts your face inches from another person's mouth, sickness cannot stay hidden. The coughing, the weakness, the fear around disease all made regular practice harder to hold together. Respectability began slipping through his fingers. That is what carried him to Dallas in 1873. He did not head west chasing adventure. He went because doctors told him the climate might keep him alive longer. At first, he still tried to remain a dentist. He partnered with John Segar, another Georgian, and together they built a proper office. They even won praise for their dental work. Their gold work and artificial dental pieces were recognized. So this part matters. He did not fail because he lacked talent. He failed because tuberculosis would not let him keep the life he had trained for. The problem was cruelly simple. He could fill a tooth with a steady hand. He could build dentures. He could do fine work. But then the coughing would come. It could hit in the middle of treatment. Sometimes there was blood. And once patients began seeing him as a sick man rather than a skilled dentist, the profession started slipping away. No one wanted a coughing dentist leaning over them. Fear spreads quickly, especially when people already do not understand the disease in front of them. By March 1874, his partnership with Segar had ended, and though he tried to keep going on his own, the collapse had already begun. That was the moment when his life started turning in a different direction. If dentistry could not support him, something else had to. Gambling stepped in because it was one of the few ways a sharp, educated, observant man could still earn money while drifting through frontier towns. His hands were already precise from dental work. His nerves were already trained by illness and grief. At the card table, those things mattered. Poker, faro, and other games rewarded focus, patience, and nerve. So the same young man who had once studied anatomy in Philadelphia now found himself reading faces in smoke-filled saloons. Of course, gambling in the West was never just a game. It was a dangerous trade. Winners were hated. Cheaters were everywhere. Men settled arguments with guns and knives because law often arrived too late, or not at all. Holliday knew his body was weak. He was thin, sick, and physically vulnerable. So he built something else to protect himself. He built a reputation. He practiced with revolvers and knives. He let stories spread. He learned quickly that fear could do the work, that strength could not. That shift became visible in Dallas in January 1875, when he was involved in a shootout with saloon owner Charles Austin. Shots were fired, but no one died. Even so, the event mattered because it added another layer to the story growing around him. A dentist with tuberculosis had stood in a gunfight and walked away. That kind of thing spread fast. Soon, the man who had once been a promising young professional was becoming something rougher in the public eye. Not because he suddenly transformed overnight, but because each loss kept pushing him further from the old life and deeper into survival. The move from dentistry to gambling happened fast, but the reasons behind it had been building for years. Loss had marked his childhood. War had broken apart the world around him. His mother's death had cut the deepest wound of all. His father's remarriage had left him emotionally stranded. Then his own illness had shut the door on the one respectable future he had tried to claim. So when people later saw Doc Holliday as some born figure of danger, they missed the real story. He did not begin there. He was pushed there piece by piece. Even after he entered the gambling world, the legends around him ran ahead of the facts. By the time he was moving through places like Dallas, Fort Griffin, Denver, and Cheyenne, stories were already painting him as a deadly killer. Yet, when historians later dug through the records, they found no verified killings tied to him before Tombstone. That is one of the most revealing parts of his story. The legend was growing while the body count people imagined was not. His reputation was often larger than reality, and that was not an accident. In the fall of 1877, Wyatt Earp rode about 400 miles from Dodge City to Fort Griffin, Texas, chasing outlaw Dave Rudabaugh after a robbery at a Santa Fe railroad camp. Fort Griffin was a hard place, and the roughest part of it was known as the Flat, a wild strip near the old army post where whiskey, gambling, and trouble mixed every night. Wyatt went straight to John Shancy's Beehive Saloon, the biggest dive in town, and started asking questions about Rudabaugh. Shancy listened, then pointed him toward a thin gambler dealing cards across the room. That man was Doc Holliday. Doc had only recently come in from Dallas, and tuberculosis was already wearing down his lungs, but his mind was sharp, and his eyes missed little. He knew Rudabaugh from poker games, and told Wyatt the outlaw was likely headed back toward Kansas. Wyatt trusted the tip enough to wire Bat Masterson, and that small exchange turned into something much bigger. In that loud saloon full of drunks, killers, and card sharks, a Southern dentist who had turned into a gambler met a hard lawman who knew how to survive. There was no shootout that night and no grand scene, just straight talk and useful information. But it mattered. Wyatt never forgot the way Doc spoke plainly in a place where most men lied for sport, and that simple meeting became the start of one of the most famous bonds in Western history. After that, Dodge City looked like a chance to start over. When Doc and Kate arrived there, they checked into Deacon Cox's boarding house as Dr. and Mrs. John H. Holliday. For a brief moment, Doc tried to reclaim the life he had once been trained for. Dodge had no dentist at the time, so he placed an ad offering his services and promising satisfaction or money back. By day, he pulled teeth and tried to look respectable. Kate even tried to play the part of a proper wife. Wyatt Earp, now serving as assistant marshal, stood by his friend and gave him support. That road carried Doc to Tombstone, Arizona, sometime after June 3, 1880. He came in with gambling money won up in Prescott. But Tombstone was not the kind of town where good fortune stayed clean for long. It was booming from silver, swollen with people chasing wealth, and rotting underneath with violence, sickness, and corruption. Doc and Kate took a room on Allen Street, between a funeral parlor and a winery, which seemed almost too fitting for a man already dying of tuberculosis. The town itself was split down the middle. On one side stood the Earps and those who wanted order. On the other stood the cowboys, men tied to cattle rustling, smuggling, robbery, and murder. Sheriff Johnny Behan was supposed to hold the line, but he leaned the other way too often and looked the other way when it mattered most. Then things turned darker. In March 1881, after a stage robbery left 2 men dead and silver missing, enemies tried to pin the crime on Doc. Sheriff Behan and Milt Joyce found Kate drunk, angry, and easy to influence after another rough stretch with Doc. They gave her more whiskey and pushed her into signing an affidavit that claimed Doc had helped plan the robbery. On her word alone, Doc was jailed. Wyatt Earp had to step in with bail money to get him out. Then, once Kate sobered up, she pulled back and said she had been tricked while drunk and did not stand by the statement. Other evidence showed Doc had been in Tombstone at the time of the robbery, and the case fell apart. Still, the damage was real. The accusation gave his enemies something to whisper and printed another stain beside his name. Even so, Doc did not answer Kate with vengeance. Instead, after all she had done for him in the past, he gave her money and sent her away. It was his way of ending the debt between them, though nothing between them was ever really simple enough to end cleanly. When the Earps learned that armed cowboys were gathered near Fly's photo gallery, Virgil Earp decided to move. He deputized Wyatt and Morgan and prepared to disarm the men. Doc, coughing and weak from tuberculosis, refused to stay behind. He wanted to go, and more than that, he wanted the shotgun. Virgil handed him the short, double-barreled gun, and Doc joined the others as they walked toward the lot. That image mattered because it showed exactly who he had become. He was a dying man who could barely breathe. Yet when the moment came, he chose to step into it instead of away from it. What followed at the OK Corral was not a graceful duel. It was a fast, messy, panicked burst of killing in a cramped space. In less than half a minute, guns roared, smoke filled the air, horses jumped in fear, and men fired from behind bodies and corners. Billy Claiborne ran. Ike Clanton fled without firing. Tom and Frank McClory and Billy Clanton stayed in the fight, and all 3 ended up dead. Virgil and Morgan Earp were hit. Doc was grazed. Wyatt came through untouched. Witnesses and later evidence pointed to Doc's shotgun blast as the shot that killed Tom McClory, and his revolver may have struck others too. It was the one fight where his deadly reputation rests on the strongest ground. Many stories followed him for years, but here, the violence was real, close, and witnessed. In that dusty lot, legend and fact finally stood in the same place. After the shooting, the legal battle was almost as important as the gunfight itself. Ike Clanton pushed murder charges, and a long hearing followed under Justice Wells Spicer. Witnesses packed the courtroom. Some claimed the Earps and Doc had gunned down men with raised hands. Others told a different story. Medical evidence cut through much of the noise, and neutral testimony helped show that the cowboys had not been surrendering peacefully when the shots began. In the end, Spicer ruled that the men were justified in what they had done while carrying out their duty. The decision freed them, but it did not bring peace. If anything, it pushed the feud into a more dangerous stage. The law had spoken. Yet the cowboys were not going to let it end there. The revenge began before the year was over. Late on the night of December 28, 1881, Virgil Earp was ambushed while walking through Tombstone. Hidden attackers blasted him with buckshot, shattering his arm and leaving him crippled for life. He survived, but the message was clear. Then came the blow that broke whatever patience Wyatt had left. On March 18, 1882, Morgan Earp was shot while playing pool. Wyatt was nearby when the bullet tore through his brother. Morgan died soon after, and with that, the fight moved beyond courtrooms and inquests. Wyatt no longer believed the law would protect his family or punish the men behind the attacks. 2 days later in Tucson, while escorting Virgil and Morgan's body toward California, Wyatt and his small group spotted Frank Stillwell near the train. Stillwell looked armed and dangerous, and the moment turned deadly fast. Wyatt chased him down and shot him hard. Doc was there too, and the killing marked the true start of the Vendetta ride. After that, Wyatt, Doc, and a handful of loyal men became a moving force of revenge across Arizona territory. They hunted those they believed were tied to Morgan's murder and the attacks on the Earps. Soon Florentino Cruz was dead after the posse tracked him down near a wood camp. Not long after that came the shootout at Iron Springs, where Wyatt and Doc rode into a camp full of cowboys, and gunfire broke loose again. Wyatt later claimed he killed Curly Bill Brocius there with a shotgun blast. Whether every detail of that fight can be proved or not, the point is clear enough. The posse was no longer defending itself inside town limits. It was now carrying the war outward, striking first and leaving bodies behind. By the time John Ringo turned up dead months later in Turkey Creek Canyon, officially ruled a suicide, though long surrounded by doubt, the old cowboy circle had already begun to break apart. Some fled, some died. Some were left behind in stories nobody could fully untangle. For Doc, all of this came at a cost his body had been warning him about for years. By 1882, he was already fading badly, but somehow he kept going. In May of that year, after the Vendetta ride, he ended up in Colorado and ran into another kind of danger. A strange little con man named Perry Mallon tried to make a name for himself by arresting Doc in Denver with wild claims and fake courage. Newspapers loved the drama and played it up, but the case collapsed under its own nonsense. Friends stepped in, officials fumbled paperwork, and the whole thing fell apart before Arizona could drag Doc back into the hands of enemies waiting for him there. Even when he was weak and coughing blood, trouble still found him, and somehow he still slipped through it. By 1884, he was in Leadville, thinner, poorer, and sicker than ever, trying to survive on gambling while mixing whiskey and medicine to dull the pain in his chest. There he had one of his last violent confrontations when a man named Billy Allen began pressing him over a small debt and carrying himself like a threat. Allen went looking for Doc, armed and ready, and when the two met in Hyman's saloon, Doc fired first. He shot Allen in the arm and fired again as the man went down. Allen survived, and Doc went to trial, but once again, he walked free. It was not a glorious moment. It was survival, the same thing his life had been reduced to for years. He was too weak for fistfights, too sick for hard labor, and too worn down for reinvention. The gun remained the one argument nobody could take from him. By the time he reached Glenwood Springs in 1887, the end was already closing around him. He was only 36, but tuberculosis had aged him far beyond his years. He came hoping the hot springs might ease his lungs, but there was no real cure left to find. He stayed at the Hotel Glenwood and spent his last weeks mostly in bed, drifting in and out of weakness and delirium, coughing blood and wasting away. Some accounts say Kate came to nurse him at the end, though the records are not fully clear. What is clear is the strange quiet of the final moment. On November 8, 1887, after days of decline, he woke with a clear mind, asked for whiskey, and drank it with pleasure. Then he looked down at his bare feet sticking out from the sheets. That sight struck him, because he had always expected to die with boots on, not in a bed, not slowly, not this way. He had lived through saloon fights, lynch threats, feuds, revenge rides, and enough danger to fill 10 lives. Yet the thing that finally took him was the sickness that had followed him almost the whole way. Looking at those bare feet, he spoke his last known words. He said, "This is funny." Then, at around 10 in the morning, Doc Holliday died. That ending carries its own kind of power because it strips away the myth and leaves the man. He was not cut down in a final duel. He did not go out with smoke in the air and a pistol in his hand. He died in a room, tired and far from the noise that made him famous. Yet maybe that is why the story stays so strong. For all the fear he inspired, for all the danger around his name, Doc Holliday was always a man fighting frailty as much as enemies. He used reputation the way other men used armor. He made himself seem harder than his body ever was, and for years that worked. He outlived the odds, outlived many of the men who wanted him dead, and stayed standing longer than anyone had reason to expect. In the end, the gunslinger legend did not vanish. It simply gave way for one last moment to something more human.